Nebraska, January 1888. Nobody noticed what was happening on the Andersen property. From a road, it looked like any other homestead, weathered cabin, thin smoke rising from the chimney, a widow working her land alone. But something was different, something hidden. While her neighbors stacked firewood and patch walls, Martha Andersen was digging, deep into the frozen prairie earth, carving out a space that would save her family when the deadliest blizzard in American history arrived without warning. What did she understand about survival that an entire community missed? If you want to discover one proven frontier technique every week, strategies that actually work when lives depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's build a community of real knowledge. Now, let's go back to that Nebraska winter. Martha Andersen wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She was 34 years old, mother of 3, widow for 2 winters. Her husband had died clearing stumps in the fall of 1886, leaving her with 160 acres, a drafty cabin, and children who shivered through the night despite the fire burning just 8 feet away. The cabin was standard for the region, cottonwood logs, mud chinking, single-wall construction. On calm days, it held heat well enough. But when the prairie wind came howling across the flatlands, it didn't matter how much wood she burned. The cold crept through every gap, every seam, every invisible crack. Her youngest, Thomas, had developed a persistent cough that November, the kind that rattled in his chest and kept him awake, the kind that worried Martha more than she let on. She'd wrap him in every blanket they owned, move his bedroll closer to the hearth, feed the fire through the night until her arms ached from splitting kindling. It wasn't enough. By December, she was burning through it faster than she could gather it. Her neighbors, good people, mostly, would sometimes drop off a cord when they had extra, but charity had limits, and everyone would struggle with the same problem. Homes that bled heat faster than fires could produce it. Martha had spent most of her childhood in a sod house 20 miles south. She remembered something her mother used to say, "The earth holds what the air cannot." That memory wouldn't leave her alone. So one morning in early December, while her children were at the schoolhouse 3 miles away, Martha Andersen picked up a shovel and started digging. Not a root cellar, not a storm shelter, something else entirely. The project made no sense to anyone watching. Martha had chosen a spot 12 feet from the cabin's north wall, close enough to access quickly, far enough to avoid undermining the foundation. She wasn't digging wide. She was digging deep, 6 feet down, then 7, then 8. The first 4 feet were frozen solid. She built fires on the ground, let them burn for hours, then scraped away the thawed earth before it froze again. Brutal, slow work. Her hands blistered, then calloused over. She worked in the early mornings and late afternoons, when the children were occupied. By the 3rd week, she created a chamber roughly 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 8 feet deep. The walls weren't smooth, just compact prairie clay and sediment, solid as poured concrete once she got below the frost line. She lined the floor with flat stone salvage from a collapsed chimney on an abandoned claim. For the ceiling, she used cottonwood poles laid tight together, then covered them with a foot of packed earth and sod. She left a narrow shaft in one corner, 4 inches wide, extending up to the surface, for ventilation. The entrance was the clever part. Instead of stairs, she dug a sloped tunnel, angling down from ground level at a gentle grade. She framed the tunnel with scrap lumber and covered it with a removable wooden hatch disguised under prairie grass and snow. From 10 feet away, you wouldn't know it existed. Inside the underground room, the temperature held steady around 48 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire, no fuel, just the thermal mass of the earth itself, insulated by 8 feet of soil that stayed above freezing year-round. She furnished it simply, a low bench along one wall, a few wooden crates for storage, wool blankets, a clay jug for water. She tested the ventilation shaft by burning a candle overnight. The flame stayed steady. Martha told her children it was a winter room, a place to stay warm if the cabin ever got too cold. Thomas asked why they didn't just sleep there every night. Because, she said, people would think we're strange. She wasn't wrong. The neighbors noticed, of course. Not at first. Martha had been careful, working when no one was around. But by late December, word had spread. The widow Andersen was digging something, some kind of hole. Nobody was quite sure why. John Reichert, who farmed the adjacent quarter section, rode past one afternoon and saw the mound of excavated earth near her property. He mentioned it at the general store in town. Digging her own grave, probably, someone joked. A few people laughed. Waste of a widow's time, said another. She'd be better off remarrying. Even the town's minister, who generally spoke kindly of Martha, seemed puzzled when he visited in early January. He stood near the covered entrance, snow dusting his hat, and asked what she was building. Just a root cellar, Martha said. He looked at the layout. Too far from the cabin, too much effort for simple food storage. Seems like a lot of digging, he said carefully. I had the time, she replied. He didn't press further, but she saw the look, the one that said, this poor woman doesn't know what she's doing. Her children heard comments at school. Nothing cruel, but enough to sting. Your ma really dug a big hole? One boy asked Thomas, what for? Thomas didn't have an answer. Martha didn't talk about it. She didn't explain her reasoning or try to convince anyone. She just finished the work, sealed the tunnel entrance, and waited. The prairie wind kept blowing. And then on January 12, 1888, the sky turned the color of old bone. It started warm. January 12th dawned clear and unusually mild for Nebraska, temperatures climbing near 40 degrees by mid-morning. Farmers worked outside without heavy coats. Children walked to school in light jackets. By noon, the wind shifted. It came from the northwest, sudden and sharp. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, then 30, then 40. By 2 p.m., the sky had disappeared behind a wall of white. Not snow, pulverized ice, driven horizontal by winds that screamed across the plains at 60 miles per hour or more. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The thermometer outside the general store read -4 degrees at 3 p.m. By evening, it would hit -40. Families scrambled. Farmers ran for their barns, some tying ropes between buildings so they wouldn't get lost in the whiteout. Teachers at the rural schoolhouses made desperate decisions. Send children home into the storm, or keep them overnight in buildings with no food and limited fuel. Many didn't make it. At the Andersen homestead, Martha had been splitting wood when the wind hit. She dropped the axe, grabbed the children from the cabin, and led them to the hidden tunnel inside the underground room. The temperature held at 47 degrees. Above ground, her cabin groaned under the wind. The fire in the hearth roared, then died as snow forced its way down the chimney. Ice formed on the inside walls. The water bucket froze solid. But 8 feet below the surface, in a chamber warmed only by the earth itself, Martha and her 3 children sat wrapped in blankets, breathing steady air, waiting for the storm to pass. Thomas wasn't coughing anymore. Stay with me. Because what happens next changed everything her neighbors thought they knew about staying alive in winter. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. You'll thank yourself when the next video drops. The blizzard lasted 3 days. During that time, the Andersen family stayed almost entirely underground. Martha would venture up to the tunnel once every 12 hours, just long enough to grab firewood, check the livestock, and assess the storm. The cold above ground was lethal. Breathing hurt. Exposed skin froze in minutes. But down in the earth room, the temperature never dropped below 45 degrees. They slept in shifts, ate cold biscuits and dried meat. The children played quiet games by candlelight. The air stayed fresh thanks to the ventilation shaft, which Martha had positioned on the leeward side of the prevailing wind. On the second night, someone knocked on the tunnel hatch. Martha climbed up, lifted the wooden cover, and found John Reichert standing there, face raw from windburn, ice crusted in his beard. My cabin's freezing, he said, voice shaking. The fire won't stay lit. Chimney's blocked. Can we? She pulled him inside before he finished question. Reichert followed her down the slope tunnel, stepping carefully on the earthen floor. When he emerged into the underground chamber, he stopped. It's warm, he said, stunned. 47 degrees, Martha said. Hasn't changed in 2 days. He held his hands out, feeling the air. No fire? No fire. He looked at the walls. the ceiling, the ventilation shaft. Then he looked at Martha. "I thought you were wasting your time," he said quietly. "I know." His family stayed with him that night. 6 people in a 10-by-8 room, but nobody complained. They were warm. They were breathing. They were alive. When the storm finally broke on January 15th, the landscape had changed. Snowdrifts 20 feet high, livestock frozen in their tracks. At least 235 people dead across the plains, most of them children caught between school and home. But in that hidden underground room, 8 feet below the frozen surface, everyone had survived without injury, without frostbite, without burning a single log. Word spread faster than the blizzard had. By February, Martha's property had become a pilgrimage site. Neighbors came to see the earth room, as people were starting to call it. They climbed down the tunnel, felt the stable temperature, asked questions about ventilation and drainage and structural support. Most importantly, they started digging their own. The adaptations varied. Some families dug simple sleeping dugouts, just deep enough to get below the frost line, with low ceilings and minimal finishing. Others excavated full chambers with multiple rooms, using the underground space for both shelter and food storage. John Riker built one behind his barn, with an entrance through the floor of his tack room. The Haugen family, Norwegian immigrants who'd survived brutal winters in the old country, dug a version they called a Jordkeller, earth cellar, with stone walls and a sod roof. By the winter of 1889 to 90, at least 12 families within a 20-mile radius had some form of underground refuge. The designs weren't identical, but the principle was the same. Use the Earth's thermal mass as a natural battery, storing stable temperatures that air-based structures couldn't maintain. The town's attitude shifted. The same people who called it a waste of time now called it frontier ingenuity. The minister mentioned Martha's wisdom in a Sunday sermon, comparing it to the parable of the wise builder who built his house on rock. Martha found the attention uncomfortable. She hadn't been trying to teach anyone a lesson. She'd just been trying to keep her children warm. But she didn't refuse help when asked. She walked neighbors through the excavation process, explained the importance of ventilation, warned about water drainage and structural integrity. The strange idea had become local knowledge, and it saved lives that the community didn't even know were at risk yet. Because the blizzard of 1888 wasn't the last brutal winter the plains would see. Martha Andersen didn't know the physics, but the physics were working for her anyway. Below the frost line, typically 6 to 8 feet deep in Nebraska, the Earth maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round. In that region, soil temperatures at that depth hover between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what's happening on the surface. This happens because of thermal mass and insulation working in tandem. Soil has high thermal mass, meaning it can absorb and store large amounts of heat energy without significant temperature changes. During summer, the Earth absorbs warmth from the sun. During winter, it releases that stored heat very slowly. At the same time, soil acts as an excellent insulator. Each foot of compacted earth provides roughly R3 to R4 insulation value. Not as high as modern foam insulation, but far better than a single-wall wooden cabin with mud chinking. 8 feet of earth created a thermal buffer that no surface structure could match. The ventilation shaft was critical. Without fresh air exchange, the underground space would have become unsafe, oxygen depleted, carbon dioxide concentrated. But a simple 4-inch shaft, positioned correctly to avoid wind pressure, provided enough passive airflow to keep the space breathable without creating drafts or heat loss. This wasn't a new discovery. Native American tribes across the plains had used similar principles for centuries. Pit houses, earth lodges, and semi-subterranean dwellings provided stable shelter long before European settlers arrived. The Pawnee, Mandan, and Hidatsa tribes built earth lodges that stayed comfortable year-round, using the ground itself as both insulation and structure. Scandinavian immigrants brought similar knowledge. In Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, turf houses and earth-sheltered barns had been standard construction for generations. Martha's innovation wasn't inventing the concept. It was remembering what the Prairie had tried to teach her as a child, and applying when her family's survival depended on it. Modern earth-sheltered architecture, houses built partially or fully underground, operates on the same principles. Stable temperatures, reduced heating costs, protection from extreme weather. The technology hasn't changed much. We've just forgotten it needed to exist. Martha Andersen lived in that Nebraska homestead until 1904. She never became famous, never wrote a book, never gave lectures about thermodynamics or vernacular architecture. She raised her children, worked her land, and quietly helped neighbors who asked for advice. But the earth room remained. Her son Thomas, who'd survived that brutal winter of 1888 thanks to a space dug 8 feet into the frozen prairie, eventually inherited the property. He kept the underground chamber intact, using it as cold storage and occasional shelter during storms. When the property was sold in 1947, the new owners found the old dugout still standing, or rather, still holding. The wooden hatch had rotted, but the earthen chamber itself was sound, its walls as solid as the day Martha had finished them. The lesson isn't complicated. We build against nature, walls to block wind, roofs to shed snow, fires to fight cold, all of it consuming resources, requiring constant maintenance, failing when conditions get extreme. But the earth doesn't fight winter. It absorbs it, moderates it, holds steady while the surface world freezes and thaws. Martha understood something that most of us have forgotten. Sometimes survival isn't about defeating the elements. It's about working with them. That strange hole wasn't backward thinking. It was engineering. The kind that doesn't need a degree, doesn't require expensive materials, and doesn't fail when you need it most. The kind that worked in 1888. The kind that still works today. Now it's your turn. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story taught you something you didn't know before, hit that like button and share this with someone who'd appreciate real survival knowledge. Subscribe for more forgotten techniques that actually save lives. See you in the next one.